Hello everybody, and welcome to this event in the Richlit Festival. My name's Judith Hawley. I'm going to be your chair for tonight, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. I can't see you at the moment because you're all silent and muted, but I know that you're out there, which is very nice for me to know. Tonight we're part of Richlit Festival, and we're going to be talking to you about Twickenhamshire and the Thames, Richmond Borough's luminary heritage landscape. I'm delighted to chair this event, and I really want to thank all the organisers of the Richmond Literary Festival who've been so welcoming and accommodating. Really also very grateful to the publishers and everyone involved in this wonderful new book called Twickenhamshire, a riverside realm of gardens and villas in the Age of Enlightenment. The co-editors of the book are Chris Sumner and Michael Symes, and Chris is going to be one of our speakers today. I'm particularly grateful that Richmond has opened up to us because we are on the wrong side of the river. We're speaking about Twickenhamshire, which is on the Middlesex side of the river. But as Michael Symes says in his book, the Surrey side is of crucial importance as it forms both the viewpoint for and the backdrop of the glorious Arcadian landscape of Twickenham. Let me introduce you to our speakers and give you a sight of the book. So on your screen now, you'll be able to see the cover of our lovely book, Twickenhamshire, one of the editors and our first speaker, Chris Sumner. And here is a slightly unrealistic, artist's impression of me a few years ago when I'd had my hair done. Emily Parker, who wrote one of the chapters of the book and will be one of our speakers today. Then Ricky Pound, our next speaker. Then Tim Coram, and last but no means least, Carol Tucker. We don't have all the authors of the book present today, sadly, and I particularly want to note the contributions of Michael Symes, Mike Cherry, who's like me, a trustee at the Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust and a fabulous local historian, and Susanna Fleming, who are not here today. But our speakers today will be telling us about the following venues, which are marked on this map, which was first published 1741 to 45. Our first venue will be Marble Hill. We'll move then to Turner's House, Orleans House and Gallery, Pope's Grotto, and ending with Strawberry Hill House. And what we're going to do in this presentation is take you on a tour of this beautiful landscape. We're taking you on a kind of 4D tour because we'll be travelling back both in time and upstream from Marble Hill to Strawberry Hill. We'll introduce you to some of the people who chose to settle and build beautiful houses on the banks of the Thames, to the social networks who link them, and also try to entice you to visit these properties by telling you something about the work we're doing now to make these sites accessible in all sorts of ways to modern visitors. Our first speaker is Chris Sumner, who originated this project and wrote several of the chapters in the book Twickenhamshire. He's an expert on the subject of the historic houses and gardens of this region, having spent his career working for such organisations as the Historic Buildings Division of the Greater London Council and the London Region of English Heritage. Chris, can you set the scene for us?
Thank you, Judith. Twickenhamshire was Horace Walpole's term for the prosperous community of courtiers, politicians, writers, actors, painters, and men and women of fashion in the happy position of being able to create for themselves houses and gardens on the Middlesex bank of the Thames between Hampton and Isleworth. In writing about the estates and their 18th and early 19th century owners, we've tried to underline the importance of what we might now call networking, and also the significance of many of the characters in the development of garden design. As has been written, the panoramic view from Richmond Hill sweeps over a stretch of the Thames that unites virtually the whole history of English landscape and garden design. It is the cradle of the English landscape movement. The view upstream from Richmond Hill, and here's a modern photograph of it, has always attracted admirers, and thanks to poets, painters, vested interests, public protests, an Act of Parliament, planning policies, and the Thames landscape strategy, it is a panorama that has remained fundamentally unaltered, although there are now more trees and fewer horsemen than when Augustine Haeckel recorded the view around 1750. However, computer modelling suggests that global warming will lead to more frequent and damaging flooding, so this is a view that may change over the next few years. The River Thames was the physical link between the properties and the very reason for their location. Medieval monarchs established a chain of royal palaces along the river. There's a code stone statue of Father Thames in Terrace Gardens at Richmond. Medieval monarchs established a chain of royal palaces along the river from Greenwich to Windsor, and the river was their highway, providing an arena for pageantry as well as a means of transport. The royal court was the chief source of patronage, and as the Stuarts and later the House of Hanover adopted Hampton Court and Kew as favourite residences, so fashionable society established itself in the locality, in an appealing and congenial environment, within easy distance by boat or coach or on horseback from central London. For many people now, even relative locals, Twickenham may mean little more than the rugby ground, an Edwardian and interwar suburbia, without much of a focus. I and my co-writer felt that that was a shame, and that there should be an interesting story to tell about the other older riverside Twickenham and its characters and properties. We tell the story in lesser or greater detail of some 25 estates on and near the Thames, and this map shows 25 of them plotted on the Roke map of 1745. The map, which is a fascinating document, covers the whole of London and 10 miles round, and is a generally pretty reliable record of what was there in the 1740s. In the main, the houses were not very large, villas rather than mansions, and the fashionable riverside location precluded extensive estates. Some villas were even separated from their gardens by a public road, Pope's Villa and Grotto Tunnel being the most famous example, but Radnor House and Crossdeep House also had their connecting tunnels, as does Garrick's Villa. The poet Alexander Pope quotes an unnamed Frenchman as saying of Twickenham, "This is very fine, but take away the river and it is good for nothing." And most of the drawings and prints of the houses and gardens we have used to illustrate the book show them as from a boat on the river or from the opposite Surrey shore. The owners were proud of their villas and enjoyed showing them off, so the external appearance of at least is often well recorded in contemporary engravings, many of which are housed in the excellent local collections at Orleans House Gallery and in the Old Town Hall in Richmond, which have been very generous in allowing us to reproduce images from their records.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. You've taken us to the river. Now we'll take you on a virtual tour up the river from Marble Hill House. So I'm going to ask you to picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. And first we're going to alight at Marble Hill, and Emily Parker will tell us about its extraordinary owner and about what we'll be able to see when you visit the gloriously revived Marble Hill House next year. Emily is an expert on the history and social history of gardens, and she's invested her time and energy and expert knowledge in a number of English heritage properties. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Judith. We arrive at Marble Hill on the riverside as Princess Caroline did in 1726. At that time, Lady Bristol described how the princess with all her children went by water last Thursday and landed to go and see Mrs. Howard's house at Marble Hill. This is the only known reference to visitors arriving at Marble Hill by river in Henrietta Howard's lifetime. But as a popular and fashionable way to travel in Twickenham, it is likely that it happened frequently. But the big question is, what would they have seen when they arrived? So Henrietta Howard, later the Countess of Suffolk, was part of Georgian court society, mistress of the Prince of Wales, later George II, and a member of an elite circle of influential cultural, intellectual and political friends. She created Marble Hill House in the 1720s as a retreat from court life and as a place to entertain these friends. When creating her home at Marble Hill, Henrietta was surrounded by a large circle of influential and often opinionated figures, especially when it came to garden design. All her friends probably had varying degrees of involvement in advising Henrietta on her garden. Alexander Pope, however, seems to have been one of the most influential, and we'll hear a bit more about Alexander Pope a little bit later on our tour, with many references to his involvement in the design in accounts, correspondence, and poems. In 1724, Henrietta Howard, Pope, and Charles Bridgeman, who would later become royal gardener to George II, met on site to discuss the design and layout of the garden. Both Pope and Bridgman were at the forefront of changing facts. This plan of the garden survives from the late 1740s, and this is just an extract of a much wider plan. This house sits in the middle at the top, and hopefully you can just about make that out, and it stretches down to the river at the bottom. The plan labels many of the garden features, including a greenhouse, ice house and ice house seat, flower garden, 9-pin alley, and grotto. It also shows the layout of the garden, revealing that it was based on ideas from classical literature and the gardens of ancient Rome. And it shows a lot of detail on planting, where hedges were located, as well as distinguishing between groves, which are trees laid out in a regular formation, orchard, wilderness areas, and densely planted areas or thickets. And Judith's doing some lovely pointing at some of these lovely wilderness areas now. And you can see some of the sort of the groves leading down to the river as well. So it's a really interesting and would have been a very interesting landscape to see from the river as well. But sadly, through the absence of consistent maintenance and a lack of understanding of the garden's significance, the evidence of its design has gradually eroded. Now, thanks to funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, we are restoring the gardens to their 18th century design, using the 1740s plan alongside archaeological investigations. This summer, these archaeological investigations at the Grotto have provided exciting new evidence for the layout shown on the 1740s plan. This is a significant area that we are hoping to be able to restore back to its early 18th century design, and they're hoping that it will provide an area for tranquil reflection and contemplation in a busy public park today, as it would have done for Henrietta Howard in the 18th century. The revival of the landscape at Marble Hill will ensure it survives as a recognisable and important historic landscape for future generations to enjoy, and that it continues to warrant its prominent position among the historic houses you're about to hear about, which are along the Thames. So we end as we began, looking down the recently restored groves, which you can see in this picture, and towards the river, just one small part of the landscape that is being brought back to life, and which includes avenues, woodland walks, an orchard, the grotto, and flower garden. This will all be ready to be explored by visitors in spring 2022.
Upstream to Sandicombe Lodge in St Margaret's, the idyllic, picturesque property designed and lived in by the great artist J.M.W. Turner. Our speaker, Ricky Pound, has worked at numerous historic properties, revealing the symbolism in their design. As house director of Turner's House, Ricky has done much to restore and interpret the property and to reveal its significance in the life of one of Britain's leading painters. Over to you, Ricky.
Thank you all for joining me. Before Joseph Mallard William Turner bought the land in 1807 on which his villa would eventually stand, Turner had previously lived in the Twickenham area. From when he was a young boy, Turner would regularly go and live with his uncle, Joseph Mallard William Marshall, in bustling Brentford. This was partly because of the fresh air that was present in West London, but also provided him with some respite from his family problems endured in his Covent Garden home, a result of his mother's serious mental illness. It was here that Turner would explore the local area and do what he did best, paint and draw. It was during this time that Turner would become a member of the Royal Academy Schools at the juvenile age of just 14. Now, in 1805, Turner, then a well-known and successful artist, rented nearby Sion Ferry Lodge, a country retreat on the edge of the Duke of Northumberland's estate at Isleworth. For nearly 2 years, Turner lived there with his mistress and several of her children. Turner used the idyllic location of the Thames to construct his own boat and sail the river, painting en plein air, that is literally out in the open, the Thameside scenes on recycled mahogany boards. And of course, in between, Turner loved to use his boat as a base to fly and course fish, sometimes with his great friend Sir John Soane. And what we can see here is an absolutely fantastic painting that Turner did when he was just 14 years old of Isleworth, and there you've got the church and the boat. Now, the Twickenham Riverside area had much appeal for Turner, concentrated as it was near the Arcadian Thames, which held many literary associations. Turner's great literary heroes had lived nearby, including the Georgian poets James Thomson and, of course, Alexander Pope, whose own famous villa and landscape garden across Deep was just over a mile away. It was from Pope's Garden that Turner would take the cuttings from the famous weeping willow trees and propagate them in his own garden at Sandycombe. Turner also used Pope's Garden as an inspiration for an elevated viewpoint constructed at the bottom of his garden. Turner was acutely aware that he was living in an area historically known for its artistic talent and for the men who had wished to settle in this matchless vale of Thames. Other individuals idolised by Turner who lived nearby included the first president of the Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, whose own Wick House was designed by Sir William Chambers and could be seen on Richmond Hill, viewed by Turner from his own first floor window. And what we've got here is a fantastic reconstruction of the view that we feel that Turner would have seen when he looked out of that window, with the ponds to the left and Richmond Hill in the distance, with Wick House just on the right of that as well. So the land which Turner bought in 1807 was around 2 acres in size. It was wedge-shaped and ran towards Richmond Bridge. Turner decided to create a large pond into which he could empty the fish that he'd caught on his various fishing trips on the Thames and on the River Brent. Descriptions indicate that this pond was surrounded by weeping willow trees and it was covered by lilies. Now, Turner decided in around 1810 to build a central tower on the most elevated part of the land to command views of the local area. However, the house was not yet livable, and it was not until 1813 that Turner decided, with undoubtedly the help of his friend Sir John Soane, to design 2 wing buildings either side of the central tower, which would provide extra living accommodation for himself and his father. Now, records show that from 1813, rates were being paid on the property, and it was then that Turner's father, who Turner affectionately called Old Dad, came and lived at the house. Old Dad took care of absolutely everything at Sandycombe Lodge. There was no maid. He did the everyday domestic chores, the weekly shop at Brentford. He looked after the gardens, and even twice a week walked to London to actually open his son's studio. Amazingly fit. It is worth pointing out that when the house was originally constructed, it was surrounded by largely open fields, and Turner would have commanding views in all directions. The only significant house in the vicinity would have been Marble Hill House, where once Alexander Pope was a regular guest of its owner, Henrietta Howard. Indeed, so isolated was that Sandycombe Lodge that for a year it was called Solace Lodge, meaning a place of retreat, a place of solitude where you could just get away from everything. But it had a double meaning because it could also be interpreted, of course, as a temple of the sun. So the garden that we see at Turner's house today is largely a recreation of the garden that Turner would have known when he lived there. The plants and flowers that are planted there today are flowers that did exist in the 19th century.
Moving to Orleans House, or as it now is, Orleans House Gallery, which is also still pretty as a picture if the building itself is sadly much cropped. Our speaker, Tim Coram, is a museum curator with a wide-ranging experience and is well placed to build bridges between past and present. As head of Richmond Art Service, he's directing the development of Orleans House Gallery. Over to you.
Thank you, Judith. I'm going to talk a little bit about Orleans House Gallery today, and I think the thing I wanted to say most of all is that amongst its distinguished neighbours in Twickenhamshire, Orleans House Gallery stands out as an absence. It's a once great house with both French and English royal connections, reduced to remnants and ruins and largely overtaken by nature. I should say right now that the gallery and grounds are beautiful and recently restored, and there's a vibrant exhibitions programme and it's very well worth a visit. But what Orleans House Gallery reveals in this evening's tour of Arcadia are the layers in the Thames landscape, our fascination with its conservation, and a reminder that all good things come to an end. So in the slide that we're looking at here, it's a rather beautiful painting by George Hilditch, known as the Richmond painter. Hilditch was born in 1803 and died in 1857, so was alive during the heyday of Orleans. As well as an accomplished painter, he was also one of our earliest photographers. Both his photographs and paintings show his fascination with the natural world and his close observation of it. And this moment, which captures sunsets during summer, almost certainly in the 1840s, is particularly evocative. Now, I wanted to share it with you because it shows that even in its heyday, Orleans House was framed by the landscape, which would eventually overcome it. And I think in some way that George Hilditch shows he understood this in this painting. What we'll see here is an aerial drawing by architect J.B. Papworth. It's in pen, ink and watercolour. It's of the house and gardens at the same time as Hilditch's painting. It shows the house when arguably at its most beautiful, before the bloated extensions which came later in the 19th century. Papworth shows the carefully managed gardens, a beautiful carriage driveway, a view to the river across parkland, and access to it via a cut across the water meadows. This taming of the landscape had started over a century before, when James Johnson, who was the first person to build on the site, came to Twickenham. He set out to exert his authority on the landscape. Johnston was an able and well-connected politician involved in major political upheavals of the period: the Glorious Revolution, the Act of Settlement, Acts of Union, the Hanoverian Succession, all of these things that were the heart of the centralisation of power in London and its growing colonial ambitions. And he was unsurprisingly also a keen land manager and gardener. And we know he commissioned a large house and garden on the site. He also commissioned James Gibbs, one of our greatest architects, to build a beautiful octagon room for entertaining. Subsequent owners extended the house and made their mark on the land, but it was Johnston who set the agenda. Now, in the next slide, you can see the octagon room, and I'll just talk a little bit about how the house then begins to decline. So the house passed through different owners, including for a time being the home of Louis Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, who became King of the French. And since his occupation, the house became known as Orleans. The house reached its greatest extent in 1900, but by the end of the century, the pleasure palace could not be sustained. Economic depression, then the Great War brought straitened circumstances to all, and the house was sold and largely demolished in 1926. The area around it was quarried for gravel, and when the Bloomsbury Group artist Duncan Grant visited and made this painting that you can see here in 1928, he showed the octagon room with the excavated ruins and gravel pit in the foreground. So in my next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened next. Nellie Ionides, now I should haste to say this is not an image of Nellie Ionides, but Nellie Ionides, a local resident, purchased the ground and saved the remnants of the buildings. And she's rightly celebrated for her commitment to conserving the site. And she sits among a group of citizens active in the first century of the 20th century, who were concerned about the rapid change in the area. Like Ionides, the local physician, dignitary and polymath, Dr. J.R. Leeson, was also committed to conserving and recording Twickenham's past. In the 1890s, while working on an archaeological dig related to Twickenham's much-needed new sewage cut, Dr. Leeson discovered close to Orleans evidence of earlier ecosystems, including the remarkable find of a Saiga antelope skull, one of a group of mammals from the Pleistocene epoch, which roamed the site many thousands of years ago. This passion for the past and commitment to conservation and public engagement in science and the arts, exemplified by people like Ionides and Leeson, eventually led to the preservation of what was left of the buildings at Orleans, and ultimately to the creation of the Borough's art collection and the opening of the gallery in 1972. Today, Orleans House Gallery and Grounds is a unique centre for contemporary arts, but is equally loved by visitors for its wild wood. The approach of the current custodians of the site, Richmond Art Service, is, like all previous custodians, defined by the spirit of the times. Today's most pressing concern is the ecological crisis and its lesson that human beings' thoughtless dominion over the land has resulted in imminent catastrophe. Our only way out of the mess is accepting our place as part of a greater ecosystem. This ecocentric approach has influenced new work by contemporary artists linked with Orleans House Galleries. The group of artists are interested in revealing the networks of life that exist in the air, the trees, water, and the layers of the earth. And here, Bryony Benj Abbott's painting of Woodchurch, which is on display currently at Orleans House Gardens Gallery, is inspired by the complexity of the networks that lie amongst the woodlands of Orleans. So Orleans' contribution to the Twickenhamshire story is to remind us that all things come to an end, even the houses of great families. So as we leave Orleans House Gallery with its wildwood and ruins, rather than thinking of kings and queens or gardeners and empire builders, I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment and to imagine the sweep of a powerful river with floodplains to the north and rising birch forests to the south, devoid of humans, but with herds of antelope grazing while hyenas and wolves watch and wait.
Thank you, Tim, for that excellent talk. And now we can open our eyes again and look at the river as it would have been in the early 18th century. And we'll come to Pope's Villa, which I'm going to be talking to you about as one of the trustees of the Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust. Slightly round the bend, that's the villa, not me. Pope's Villa is, I think, crucial to our understanding of the significance of Twickenham in the 18th century. As a sign of the importance of Pope's domain, more pictures were made of his villa than at any other private house during this period. And when my colleagues have been talking about the networks and the historic appeal of the neighbourhood, it's very often the arrival of Pope in 1719 that these other people refer back to, and they came here because Pope came here. This is a beautiful prospect of the River Thames, which also hangs in Orleans House Gallery now. And it's a panoramic view of a stretch which shows Pope's Villa, which is the broadish yellow building left of centre. And you can see it in relationship with its neighbours, this sense of its placement in connection with other buildings and its use of the landscape, almost a borrowed landscape as you find in Japan. Why was Pope's house so famous, and why was Pope such a draw to other important and interesting people later on? Well, Pope was primarily a poet, and he's Britain's most important poet between Milton and Wordsworth, but he also influenced culture more broadly. As a translator of Homer and editor of Shakespeare, he popularized the classics and brought them within reach of more people. As a satirist, he excoriated what he saw as the debasement of culture and lashed at the corruption of politicians, how unlike our own period. He was proud, he said, to see men not afraid of God, afraid of me. And as a garden designer, as we've already seen, he influenced other people who built in the area, and he brought an increase in naturalism to garden design. There's a tension between the natural and the designed. And in a poem he wrote to his friend, the Earl of Burlington, he wrote a lot about this tension. And he describes false taste. And he tells his friend Burlington, and he applauds Burlington for achieving the right balance. To build, to plant, whatever you intend, to rear the column or the arch to bend, to swell the terrace or to sink the grot, in all, let nature never be forgot. Now this print of Pope's Villa, made in around 1735, shows visitors arriving by boat to visit Pope. And Pope earned the money to build this villa from his translation of Homer, but partly because of the money he lavished on the villa and the 5-acre garden that he had behind it, he then had to translate Homer's Odyssey to make ends meet. He also had to go to some depth to make ends meet. That is, his villa lay on one side of the river, lay next to the river on one side of a road, the road that connects all of our houses today. But his garden, which eventually, as I said, grew to be 5 acres, lay on the other. He constructed a tunnel under the road to connect the two, and in this tunnel he created a richly imaginative grotto. It's the most beautiful underpass in all of Britain. Samuel Johnson remarked, he extracted an ornament from an inconvenience, and vanity produced a grotto where necessity enforced a passage. Pope developed this villa as a place where friends, including politicians and writers, could gather to discuss the issues of the day. It's a kind of early salon. And he introduced them to his garden. He fed them with fruits and vegetables from his garden. And the verses underneath the poem there, underneath the print, are probably too small to read, but they mention many of the delicacies that his garden produced for his visitors. Not only his friends and admirers came to see him, numerous people, tourists, poetry lovers, day trippers, flocked to the villa while he was alive, and in increasing numbers after he died. The visitors were so oppressive to its owner, Baroness Howe, who owned the property at the turn of the 19th century, that she did what any sensible person would do to discourage visitors, and she knocked the villa down. She completely flattened it. And our wonderful painter Turner painted a picture of this and wrote some slightly weak verses on it. So we only have the grotto, and that's in a shabby condition at the moment. We're making it accessible in imaginative ways to modern visitors. First of all, the expert in computer modelling, Professor Paul Richards, has created a kind of virtual journey up the Thames through the grotto and into the garden. And this is a view of the back of the villa, something that has not been seen since 1807, 1808, of the Shell Temple. The grotto is still in use. The building that sits over it now is a school, and lots of the young people from the school use it on a regular basis. It used to be used as a shortcut to the playing fields on the other side of the road, but those playing fields no longer exist. And here we have a group of students having a sort of grotto Gothic reading session. The funding that we've fortunately acquired through such organisations as the National Heritage Lottery Fund has allowed us to plan both a full refurbishment of the villa and also an ambitious programme of activities. So as well as being used by the students of the school above, we have lots of activities which the inspirational storyteller Giles Abbott is developing with local schools, and especially for pupils with special educational needs. And he's introducing them to the rhetorical tools that Pope used in the 18th century, which can be adapted for contemporary language. Other young people who are not currently in employment, education or training, are working with us to interpret Pope and his grotto. And we're greatly expanding our pool of volunteers to keep alive what Pope called a scene for contemplation. Now, let me take us to our final stop on our journey up the Thames. And we come now to Strawberry Hill House. The visionary writer, dilettante collector Horace Walpole was drawn to the area by Pope, and he claimed to see Pope's ghost skimming under the window by a most poetical moonlight. And our speaker, Carol Tucker, is one of the expert volunteers who keep history alive for our visitors.
Travelling by river from Pope's Villa, we arrive at Strawberry Hill House, Horace Walpole's little Gothic castle. Now, it's not easy to pigeonhole Horace Walpole. He could be described as a collector, a writer, an antiquarian, and even an amateur interior designer, if such a role existed in the 18th century. After the death of his very powerful father, Sir Robert Walpole, he must have felt free to express himself, and he came to the Twickenham area looking for a summer villa. Twickenham and the river location attracted Horace Walpole for some of the reasons already suggested by the other speakers: the historic connections, the nearby royal palaces, Kew, Richmond, Hampton Court, and not to mention the homes of the other important figures who we meet in the book Twickenhamshire, and in particular Pope, whose ghost, as Judith has just said, he imagined as skimming beneath his windows. And he found an unpretentious, rather cramped, formal lodging house, but with the all-important river views. Its basic simplicity gave him carte blanche to develop his ideas of both house and garden. And the relationship between the house, the garden, and the river view were very important to his thinking. And even before he began work on the house, he was building up his terrace with views down to the river and planting trees to give these views a framework. And with the addition of Gothic details such as the windows, the pinnacles, the crenellations, the house itself became a fictive creation of his view of English history and could be described as a personal portrait of the man himself and his passions. As he wrote, "It was built to please my own taste and to some degree realise my own visions." The garden, however, was never intended to be Gothic. He had strong views on gardens, which he outlined in his book on modern gardening, which has been described as the most brilliant and most influential essay ever written on English garden history. For nearly 40 years, he continued to extend his house, buy more land, and add to his eclectic collections of antiquities, ceramics, paintings, books, medals, and weird and wonderful objects, which luckily for us, he recorded in his description of his villa, in his prolific correspondence, and by commissioning watercolours of the main rooms in the house and of the garden. So this print is based on a watercolour by Paul Sandby and shows how Walpole wished his house and its river setting to be viewed. It suggests a Claudian landscape and can be seen as a romantic ideal rather than an attempt to record the actual view. And throughout his life, the river continued to give him solace. He wrote, "I feel myself like a swan that after living 6 weeks in a nasty pool upon a garden is got back into its own Thames. I do nothing but plume and clean myself and enjoy the verdure and the silver waves." I think it's a quote that gives you something of the flavour of the fanciful way he wrote as well. So here we have the only known portrait actually of Walpole actually in his house. And it is a carefully curated image showing him in his library, surrounded by his books, accompanied by one of his beloved spaniels, and with the river view behind him. After Horace, Strawberry Hill had a checkered history, and now it can be seen brought back to life after the 2010 restoration. And as well as the house, we have tried to restore the main garden as Horace himself would have conceived it, with planted lime trees in a booth formation. We've brought back feathery robinias to surround the house and planted groves of sweet-smelling shrubs, particularly his much-loved lilacs, and we have created his serpentine walk. And although today the river views are now obscured, we offer our visitors special garden and landscape tours to try and compensate for this loss. We describe the views as Horace would have seen them, aided by copies of his watercolours. And we take our visitors down to Radnor Gardens to suggest something of the 18th century landscape. So we can see where Pope had his villa and his famous garden, which indeed Horace used to show off to his guests. And we look down towards Twickenham, and you can just about recognise the seaport in miniature that Horace himself described. So do come and visit us, and you'll find more information on our website.
Thank you so much, Carol. If you want to find out more about the book and about our beautiful locations, including the ones we haven't been able to cover today, there are plenty of places where you can purchase this book, from the houses themselves, Strawberry Hill, Turner's House, Pope's Grotto, Orleans House Gallery, and Marble Hill when it opens in spring. It's available online, and also from the wonderful Open Book bookshop in Richmond. I do want to give a plug to that fabulous institution. Before I open up to questions and thank our speakers formally, I want to give another plug to our lecture series, the London Luminaries lecture series. We've just come to the end of our first series, but we're beginning again in January, and we'll be talking in more detail about some of the houses that you've heard about today, Orleans, Marble Hill, Strawberry, and so on, and also talking about Boston Manor. So do try to keep in touch with us if you can. If you have any questions for our speakers or any comments you'd like to make, any recollections of your visits to the neighbourhood perhaps, do please put them in the chat, and I'll pull them out of the chat and put them to the speakers. Thank you all of you for the insights you've given us into these different places. We've got one question from somebody who said he's a little bit confused about where the properties are, where they're located, and why are they all on the same side of the river. I wonder if we could sort of go back to Chris and think about why these properties, why are we concentrating on properties on the Twickenham side? And we've given you a geographical sequence of how they're related to each other, but can we think a bit more about when they were built and when the different people inhabited them?
There are various reasons for that. One, I think, is that the land across the river from Twickenham was largely part of the Ham estate and therefore not available for development for what were essentially large suburban villas. It was the fact that the road that follows the river on the Twickenham side is high enough above water level to give you a kind of a dry house even in times of flood. And that was the fashionable side to live on at the time. Richmond was more urban, further out was less accessible from central London. It was just a kind of perfect combination of circumstances, really.
That's fascinating. So there's a mixture of kind of geographical and social features. Yeah. The land ownership and sort of who people bought from and their previous attempts to move in, their attempts to rent places is something that comes up in various talks. I'm conscious that Ricky, you talked about Turner renting various places before he came here.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said in my talk, he was used to this area of London anyway. When he rented Sime Ferry Lodge, it was a very practical reason for him to do that. He wanted somewhere away from central London and from all the pressures of work there, but he wanted something very picturesque, somewhere he could just go out on his boat and have time, really. And that lasted about 2 years. He was obviously looking for somewhere else nearby. And that is when, as I said, he was renting in Hammersmith for a little bit longer till 1811. And it was during that period, he was obviously casting his eye, casting his net, and he come on this piece of land eventually where he would build Sandycombe, which, again, I alluded to, was surrounded by really open countryside. Marble Hill House was the most significant place he could see, from his house. Lots of open fields, somewhere he could feel, safe and enjoy, and actually bring people from the Royal Academy as well. He had certain parties in the gardens here, and they would go, locally on the Thames. They'd go to the pubs, they'd go to the taverns. We know they'd get off, for instance, in Ham, and they'd have picnics, and it would always end up really back here with old Dad bringing out some beverages for them on the back lawn. So it really, for Turner, was a place he could escape to. But unfortunately, he couldn't come to Turner's house, Sandycombe Lodge, as often as he wanted to, particularly after, Europe opened up after really the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. 2 years later, he was heading abroad virtually every year to see different countries. And so he was limited in the time he could spend at Sandycombe, but he certainly wanted somewhere in this area. And as I said, also somewhere he could be mentioned in the same sentences, as some of the luminaries that we talk about, Alexander Pope, for instance, Godfrey Kneller, and so he would be in that sentence, that bunch of luminaries.
Let's think back then to I think the properties built here, is it Pope's Villa or Orleans House? Tim, can you remind us when Orleans House was first built?
Yeah, so the Orleans was built in around 1720, so it's one of the earliest houses along the river. And Johnston was this incredible kind of politician who moved in extraordinary circumstances, and he retired. He wanted somewhere which was not in the centre of London, which was close enough to keep in touch with his friends, and it seemed to be the obvious place. Now, having said that, one of the interesting things about Orleans is that people didn't tend to stay for very long, so it passed through hands quite regularly. And one of the things I imagine about this whole stretch of the river is the intensity of the social relationships, the relationships between the people who lived in those places, and also how they felt about their role and their position in society. And so, as well as the houses and coming and going, one of the things that I think is extraordinary about this set of luminaries is the pace of change in terms of society. So from about 1720, Orleans had this incredible churn of people, and the house getting bigger and bigger, and then getting almost too big to manage, almost bloated.
Which is one of the cases with lots of places which become resorts of wealthy people. I'm thinking of cottages, so-called cottages in America, which are actually just a series of mansions and so on. And I'm going to ask similar sort of questions about Marble Hill and then Strawberry Hill, about when it was built, why the person built it there. And also I want to think about how much of the year people spent in these places. So can I come to Emily? Can you tell us a bit about when and why Henrietta Howard came there?
So Henrietta Howard started building her house and thinking about building her house in about 1723, and then it started being built in 1724. But it wasn't completed until 1729, although we know people visited before that. So there was obviously something there to see. And she didn't retire from court until the 1730s. So she wasn't really kind of living there until that sort of early 1730s. And she kind of built it as an escape from that court life, somewhere to retreat to after her court life had sort of ended, and perhaps as a bit of an escape from court life, because court life is getting a bit tricky towards this time with Queen Caroline and King George II. So I think it was much more of a sort of retreat in that period. And there's something quite interesting about sort of the land ownership as well, in that she was leasing a lot of her land, and she was building it up over a very long period of about 40 or 50 years even, where she was gradually gaining small areas of land, leasing areas, buying some when she could, and trying to amalgamate it into one sort of estate. So the kind of, by the end of her lifetime, the Marble Hill we see to say is the Marble Hill that she owned, but it was very much a piecemeal process from 1724 onwards.
As it was with Pope's villa, acquiring it by thrift. In fact, there's a really interesting comment from one of our audience members about big landlords like Thomas Vernon, who rented both to Pope and Henrietta Howard. And so that, and Chris mentioned the Ham estate being owned by someone. And so that ability to build and develop and settle depends very much on a pattern of ownership and how you can.
And Thomas Vernon wasn't keen to, he leased a bit to Henrietta and then refused to lease any more. And that was part of her problem. And Pope and Duke of Argyll and people locally are all sort of in consternation for her that she couldn't rent the land and lease the land that she wanted to do.
Right. I want to come into Strawberry Hill, and then I got some questions about the garden and more about the natural land and the gardened land in a moment. Carol, can you tell us about Strawberry Hill? And it's a summer house for Horace Walpole, isn't it? It's not a year-round venue. And when does he build, and why there?
Right. Well, he initially leased this house in 1747. It turned out to be a complicated process. It needed an Act of Parliament because it's nominally owned by minors. But anyway, he bought it outright in 1749, started his conversion in 1750. Now, why it was Twickenham? Well, I sort of suggested this sort of romantic notions of the history and the royal connections. We do know he stayed in Twickenham as a young boy with relations. In the letters, it's rather odd because there's, he tells you so many things, but he just suddenly announced he's bought this little house in Twickenham. So we don't know kind of what his thought process was. And again, as I rather suggested when I talked, I think he chose what was then called Chopstraw Hall, a very basic little house, because it did give him an opportunity to do whatever he liked with it. I mean, obviously Pope's Villa only a few years previously had been on the sale. There are other properties around that were changed hands round about that time, but maybe he might have felt constrained by a much more imposing house.
Yes. So there's a way in which modern patterns of ownership and moving into a hotspot and building and developing, and people with disposable incomes investing in their properties and moving on is something that's happening in the 18th century. Yeah.
Yes. It's quite interesting, all the kind of, as were picked out from the speakers, how things were changing and moving and adapting all the time.
But one crucial feature is something that Chris mentioned, and actually a couple of our audience members have mentioned, and that is the river. I mean, it's the form of transport, it's the draw, it's the view that everybody wants to have from their windows, but it's also a source of great risk and danger. So the Twickenham side is it's slightly higher than the other side. It's less liable to flood. Though one of our audience members remembers going to school in the old St Catherine's School on the site, and the river regularly flooding in the 1960s. And if our world leaders don't get their acts together at COP26, there's a real danger that we'll lose this heritage, which we nearly lost before. I wonder if anybody would like to address these issues of flooding in particular. I leave this open to any of you to respond.
Thames Landscape Strategy has recently published a paper on the issue of flooding, the need as it's perceived to kind of allow the river to settle into its original bed to some extent, in as much that during the 19th and 20th centuries is very much embanked. And you've got now, with heavier rainfall, you've got more water coming down, you've got more runoff from roads, roofs, sewers and things. So the water doesn't get away as quickly as it might do. So Thames Landscape Strategy is looking seriously at how the water can be better managed to try and avoid disastrous floods. And that's going to be an ongoing process. And I do recommend that people look at the Thames Landscape Strategy website to see what current thinking is on.
Is it something, thank you very much, is it something that affects Marble Hill in particular? And thinking about the garden work that has been going on there, has that had to take into account climate change and the river?
So Marble Hill does flood, and I've definitely seen, I haven't flooded since I've been working on the project, but it has flooded, and I've seen pictures of it flooded in the past. And I think one of the things that we put into consideration was what we were going to plant in those avenues, because they are very much in the kind of flood plain, area. So we went for things like poplars, white poplars and black poplars, because we know that they've done really well in the site already in those sort of flooded areas. So there's also sort of some potential for sort of wetland meadow areas. So we've been doing a lot of work on creating sort of wetland meadows in the kind of area that is more wet, nearer the southern side of nearer the Thames. So I think it has flooded, and it's always flooded as a site. So it's very much on those kind of gravels. It's that kind of landscape which has that kind of sort of natural topography and natural flooding. So I think we've got to work with it and not work against it. So I think that's what we've tried to do in our restoration.
There was a question specifically about what trees were in the photo, and those are the white poplars, are they?
So we can see the white poplars and the black poplars. The other ones which make the kind of very strong avenues down to the river are Aesculus indica, which is Indian horse chestnut. And that's quite an interesting point in terms of conservation, perhaps, in that we know from the archives and from the records that they would have been horse chestnuts. But due to sort of issues with these trees, they get things like diseases like horse chestnut bleeding canker. We decided it wasn't appropriate to replant them into a site that we know already has some of these issues. So we chose a plant which has a similar habit, a similar sort of overall feel, and has the same sort of flowers that could create that effect, but without planting something that we knew wasn't going to thrive on the site.
Tim, is this something that you want to address, thinking about your current exhibition and the work on the wood at Orleans House?
Yeah, I think this is very much on everybody's mind at the moment in terms of how we manage our landscapes, also how we manage our organisations and buildings, and making sure that they are sustainable. But in particular, the work that we do at the moment with contemporary artists who are particularly interested in issues around climate change and climate justice. A lot of the great art that's being produced now is addressing these very specific issues. And it's not just about works of art, it's also about how the artist can be involved in engaging with people and encouraging them to think afresh about their relationship with the natural world. So one of the things that we're developing at Orleans is what we call an ecocentric approach to the development of the landscape, which is thinking about developing it not just from the point of view of the human beings that clearly have a kind of in the past have had dominion over it, but now just thinking about how it should be managed in terms of a long-term sustainable space for all of the organisms that live and share that space. So it's absolutely 100% influenced by current thinking around sustainable development, but I think also picking up very much on the way that artists are responding to that. And some of the most exciting work that's being created at the moment is tackling these issues. I mean, Briley's work is beautiful, but other work that other artists have been working with recently are also doing it in a much more hard-edged and combative frame of reference. So very interesting work at the moment, and part of our role is to reflect that work that's going on, so that we're very much a window into the work that artists are currently doing around these complex issues.
We should draw to a close fairly soon, I think, but I would also want to draw in Ricky and Carol to talk about their gardens some more, because in a way, the people who created the houses created the gardens. The gardens are works of art. So can I ask Ricky and then Carol to talk about that sort of full artistic dimension of the garden and what it meant to the creators of the house.
Turner had about 2 acres, which ran towards Richmond Bridge. We are basing our research, as I say, on the plants that were around at the time. We know that, for instance, a lot of the time old Dad who considered himself a farmer, had a small part of the garden just to grow the vegetables, to be self-sufficient. And that was a large part of it for Turner. But there are other elements, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of that rising platform, really, that probably come from Pope's Grotto towards the end of the garden. So you had that elevated viewpoint, out towards the Thames. And I think it was very important for Turner as well, that when he built the house, that at least from one of the windows, he could see the river. But, we know that he could because we've done research. So that was important as well. I think that very much that connection with Turner and the river was very much what Turner was about. And, and all the big mythological paintings where you see rivers, it's all based on the Thames. The Thames is the ultimate picturesque river for Turner, no matter what country it is, wherever it is the Thames. It's a river he was brought up on. It was a river he painted constantly. He sketched, he sailed, he fished. It was all very interactive, very organic for him and his father as well. So I think the gardens are really important. And what we've tried to do at the moment is give an essence of that in miniature. Of course, we've got very little of that garden, but for instance, come the spring when it does bloom, and it's taken 4 years to really get the garden to where it is today. It's absolutely beautiful, the colours and also the wildlife as well. The bees, for instance, buzzing around, and it's such a tranquil area. It's very quiet. You look back, it's very picturesque villa, quite rustic, and you just kind of imagine what it would have been like in Turner's time and why he absolutely loved it there, and why old Dad eventually in 1826 didn't want to go. He's really getting on by this time. His health's not good, and Turner says, "Look, we have to go, Dad. We have to go for your own health. It's been good while it's lasted, but I'm upset as well." But what a lot of people don't know, Turner also had other pieces of land which he kept deliberately. A little piece in what is now St Margaret's, the meadow, where he had old crop here, which eventually he sold to the railway company. He got a very nice profit on that as well. But also land off Twickenham Green to build this almshouse that he had grand plans for once he died. So very important area, and the river is really at the heart of his vision.
Thank you. Carol, can you tell us a bit more about Horace Walpole's vision for his garden?
Yes. I mean, what we have recreated, he started off with 5 acres, and he kept on buying and buying and buying land, and he ended up with something like 36 acres all around. But basically, his core garden is what we have recreated in front of the house, except, of course, we do not have that drop down to the river. That's now covered by suburban housing. But the key thing was this river view. This kind of was the focus. And also, he was very keen on the relationship between his house and the garden. So views from the windows were very much designed to look out at his plantings. And if you walk into the grounds, then carefully designed views back to the house, breaks in trees and so forth. He was very much aware of what William Kent was doing, and he was a great admirer of Rousham, and he was a great admirer of Pope's Garden as well. So you get this idea of, I think it was you who mentioned the borrowed landscape. So fairly small grounds in front of the house, but of course you had that view rolling down towards the Thames and looking out at the other side. He was also interested in a curious mixture of this kind of formal and informal. He had his little groves of lilacs and other things, and smell, he said, was more important than the looks of the flowers. He talked about lilac tide, and he always liked to be down at Strawberry Hill for the lilacs. And he talked about grief as well. But what I hadn't mentioned in the talk, because we have limited time, he did have a little cottage across the road. And it would be so lovely to have had more than 1 or 2 watercolours of that, because that had a little flower garden. And that was sort of quite different to the kind of formal 18th century garden you had. You had flowers like hollyhocks and very, very cottagey and pretty. And someone has suggested that it actually was influenced the way Humphrey Repton was working later on. We certainly know that Repton visited Strawberry Hill. And of course, like all 18th century gentlemen, he had his fields, he had grazing fields, agricultural fields, kitchen garden, more than likely had a hothouse against a wall that still survives. Interesting point, because I mean, he was right in the middle of the 18th century and you know, cusp of things changing.
Now, I've got one lovely comment I'm going to end on from a memory from one of our audience members. But before I end with that, I just wondered if any of the speakers had other comments to make or questions to ask of each other.
The only thing I think is just a general thing, which is one of the things that I've really enjoyed about learning about Orleans House is the accessibility of the sources, and I think we all have responsibility for caring and developing those sources. I look after the Borough Art Collection. I know that other people have fascinating sources. And it's just a suggestion that if anybody's interested, the sources are a tremendous asset, and it's fascinating. And I'm sure, I'm just hopefully speaking for everybody, we love to talk to people about those sources and make them available.
And actually, one of our audience members has offered some information that there are people who live in Twickenham now who have information they can offer, and that I don't know whether the Twickenham Museum might be a place where you could deposit your memories. There's also a wonderful web resource called Layers of London. We've had a lot of images of layering and things lying underneath and things being mapped on top of other things. This thing called Layers of London where you can contribute information. So one of our audience members went to St Catherine's Convent in the 50s and 60s and used Pope's Grotto to go from one side of the river to the other, and was always fascinated by the flint glistening in the half dark, and the alcoves where Pope used to sit, and there were all the mirrors. Loved visiting Clive Road. Presumably that's where Kitty Clive lived in Little Strawberry, and played in the grounds, and lived in Kew Gardens, and saw the river when it flooded in the 1960s. So we have lots of living memories of people for whom this historic heritage is part of their experience. And I think that's one of the things that makes this such a special part of the world. Thank you to our audience, and thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you also to the organisers of the Rich Lit Festival and to Rachel behind the scenes. Goodbye.